I normally use this time to go in detail on like specific players, but the Celtics have so many just known commodities on the roster that these questions just they're the 11 of 10 no notes team basically this year.
Yeah.
What makes Jayson Tatum so divisive? What like the whole this was the Team USA discourse was off the rails, but like this has been something that's been brewing. Like obviously not through the lens of what's Steve Kerr doing or should he be playing, but what makes him such a divisive star again on a national scale for sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I've been trying to figure that out too. Maybe the fact that he plays for the Celtics and everyone who's not a Celtics fan isn't crazy about the Celtics. Some people are, but for the most part, whether it's Lakers fans, Heat fans, Knicks, all the way down the line, people don't love the Celtics league wide for a number of different reasons. Number two, I think he's a little boring, not as flashy as some of these other stars. I think it showed most in that whole Edwards Tatum discussion, and that almost became the finals. Became a little bit of a thing on the U.S. team too, who was going to be that secondary wing, and Edwards ended up taking it. He, I think, is the more forceful, willing to assert himself, or demanding of asserting himself, and the bigger personality, obviously, between the two players. And for Tatum, more low key, more reserved, and more conciliatory in his approach. I think, like we talked about earlier, his power through that whole run was his passing. And he deferred and he utilized the guys around him, and he didn't have the best individual performance on the way of the championship, but it was super effective. And so, yeah, I don't want to compare him to Duncan because I don't think there's any comparison there. But in terms of the way he affects the game, at least on this last run, it was more Duncan-esque in terms of you have a ton of skills, you have this width of impact, so rely on doing a little bit of everything rather than mastering one, especially scoring. And that was what he did coming into the league. It's what he did 3-4 years ago. And so people had that image of him, and it looks like that's taken a decline, even though it's just been more him spreading himself out in terms of how he's impacting the game. So I think there's an analytical approach with him that he's taken on too, and that's frustrated even Celtics fans, how many threes he's shooting, how few mid-rangers he's going to. I think that can throw his rhythm a little bit off too if people are cutting off part of his game at the rim or outside. The three-point shot is certainly super inconsistent for him. So yeah, there's some nits you can pick in his game. He's not the best player in the league, and I think that's part of it here too, is he's aspiring to get there. Some Celtics fans or fans of him think he is, but he's not quite there yet. So you're really drilling on the things or the parts of his game that are preventing him from getting to that spot. And will he ever get there? Maybe. He's only 27 this year. This is
He's
go
only
time
19,
for that.
let's be honest. Like
This is go time for that, right? Next 3 years here, can he get to that top echelon of the league? But he's right there. And he has a width of impact, as I keep saying, that no other player at that top level has. Maybe Giannis, but Giannis can't shoot threes. So the width of his impact is what I think his power is. So in some ways, he's what master of none, right? He's got all of these different skills, but he isn't at the top echelon of any of them.
Yeah, and I love the phrasing of the width of his impact. It does seem I feel like I'd be more receptive to it if people were focusing on what felt like legitimate criticisms, like kind of being erratic on the off the dribble 3-point shot. Has that become too much of a crutch at times? But it never seems to be focused there. I also wonder if any of this is sort of long-standing blowback from he just came into the league and was so good, and there might have been at times a rush to coronate him to be in the same conversation as other top 5 to 10 guys in the league. And so did that condition people to doubt him? Or is this just, you mentioned at the top of the podcast, so they kind of fail in 2022, like fail by reaching the finals and they lose. But it's like him and Jaylen Brown have been around for so long, forever. That perception, like if he doesn't get over the hump or if he's not, the unquestioned most valuable player on his team because Jaylen Brown wins finals MVP. And I also think, finally, to wrap up my own point is, I think collectively there needs to be a better job of contextualizing a player's impact, because I probably would have picked Jayson Tatum to win finals MVP for me, just because you mentioned the passing, but also I really do value adaptability and the influence that your game or the attention you draw has on everyone else on your team. And I don't think a lot of the scoring performances that Jaylen Brown has are necessarily possible if Jayson Tatum is not on his team and drawing the, just the defensive attention that he does. And so I find just we reach this point sometimes with players, but it just feels like the perception of him veers so far away from reality. And I honestly don't understand. You mentioned his personality. That should make him like that should depolarize him. And so it's like this guy's like kind of quiet. And so like and we also aren't we at a point where people are questioning the value of heliocentric play. It's like that's the problem with Trae Young is who can he fit with. That's why James Harden maybe hasn't aged as gracefully as he
Luka,
adapted enough.
yeah.
But Jayson Tatum isn't that, but it seems like that's a problem that people have is that he's not the heliocentric type of star either. And so I just find I've tried to wrap my head around it for like the past 2 years and I still don't understand it.
Yeah, and those two styles went against each other in the finals. Luka had to do everything for Dallas, that wore him out, and Tatum, uh, they keyed in on him, and he spread the ball around, and it led to a 4-1 final. So the consistency with him will be key. He, as we talked about earlier, one of the stories of this year, can he stick to that style? Can he continue to be a conciliatory player despite the criticism he's receiving for his approach to the game? And balancing that analytical style with a little more freedom, a little more flexibility. I do have frustration sometimes with the way they utilize him. They make the game incredibly hard on him to allow for an easier game for everybody else. And yes, that's effective for winning, but it probably does get frustrating for Tatum sometimes that he does have to deal with a double team every time or see three bodies at the rim. And he's got to hit shots like the step back threes and all that stuff to be able to get his own. And he's great at it. But it does take a hit on his efficiency sometimes. He does ride highs and lows with his own offense. But fortunately, he just seems so content doing what he needs to win. And that'll solve everything for him. If he can stay committed to him, knock off multiple championships, 2 or 3 and 4 years, 5 years. And like we talked about earlier, he is going to get back to a point where his scoring, his ability to put the ball in the basket is going to have to drive this a little bit more once they have less effective pieces around him. But for now, there's such a great team around him. If he passes all day and his scoring takes a hit and they're winning, I don't think any Celtics fans can have a problem with that. And there might be people who have issues with him on the outside in terms of how he approaches it. But I love what he did in the playoffs. The three-point shooting concerns me a little bit because it is so central to his game that if that stays in the high 20s, that's going to be a problem. So that's definitely something to watch for this year. But everything else, I thought, hit the mark in the playoffs.
You mentioned this a little bit already, but I want to see if you can get into more detail about it. What kind of stood out to you most about Jaylen Brown last year? As someone who, at this level, just to continue incrementally improving year over year is kind of mind blowing when you like from about an all NBA player and like just continues to get better every single year that he's been in the league. What kind of stood out to you the most, though, about how he was playing last year?
That we had that conversation in November after that Hornets game where he had a tough time fitting in, shot selection, all the rest. Where's he going to get his? Will he get lost? All those concerns you had going into the year because he was the guy who would have the most difficult time adapting to this, everyone thought. And then he slid into that secondary role, shot well, got it back into that mid-range area where he was so effective in 23, and more importantly, ended up being the finisher for this team. And I love the way he breaks open rim protection by just going through guys. The strength he played with last year on both ends showed from his offseason training. But he also cut down the turnovers. And I thought in spots looked like an effective secondary playmaker. Now, you probably want to minimize the amount of time the ball's in his hands, but he's not allowing himself to be boxed in to any single role. And that gave him flexibility too in this offense. He could run some sets. 2 years ago when he was out there and Tatum was off, it was a disaster. That went better this year. They obviously had different guys that they could slide in the second units with him too. But the biggest surprise of all was the two-man game with Porzingis, and that unlocked him. That got Porzingis involved consistently into some of those second units. And it ended up being one of the more pleasant surprises the early portion of last season is that those two guys played so well off each other. They became best friends. You found someone on the team that Brown really jived with. And he seemed to just be more comfortable in Boston and on the team as a whole and never settled, kept pushing. The vocal leadership from him, I think, was super important too, because that doesn't always seem to be as natural for Tatum. And he said as much that when Smart left, I had to step into that role. And I loved the way he would challenge Tatum, challenge the team. The defensive emphasis he set to start the year, I think, was an important point a year ago when he signed the extension. And he followed through with defense that I think was the main reason he won Finals MVP on Luka there. And throughout, he took big assignments. So all of that ended up being super surprising, silenced a lot of the doubts in him. You look back to where he was a year ago, coming off the East Finals Game 7 meltdown. And for him to win both Finals MVP and East Finals MVP, those awards usually just go by default to who people think is the best player on the team. But that he had such staggering support for both of those awards in the voting says a lot about him. And he got back to a point where it looked like Tatum was separating himself as the most important central player on this team. Both of their flexibilities allowed either of them to be the star or the option when necessary, based on how defenses regarding them or who had it that night or anything. And even as the playoffs went on, those guys got a lot more connected. So I guess the most surprising thing about Brown and Tatum this year is that they work together. I think that was a real question before, and they made it work with each other. And now they're going to be teammates for the foreseeable future, and they're champions together, which was never certain. So for everybody who believed in them and their ability to stay together and make it work, they got affirmed. And the Celtics, who pretty much were willing to do anything but split those guys up, got affirmed too in their belief in those two guys. And it looks important now because they're the young ones. They're the guys who are going to continue getting better, and they're the ones that keep them in contention even after some of these older guys move on.
Brown did have the type of year that did, like, the passing and decision-making on his drives, I thought, got a lot better. And then if you go back and look, like, a few years ago, what he could do on the ball versus what he's doing now, it felt like his on-ball attacks were faster, and just the level of counters he's added. This is not just a last season thing, but, like, over the years, it's almost unrecognizable, and it's given me hope just based off his, progress isn't linear, but with Jaylen Brown, it feels like it has been linear. It's kind of giving me hope that, like, oh, like, maybe the handle will continue to get better and that there is continued development as a playmaker, because like you said, the assist percentage went up, the turnover percentage went down, and it's a big deal to have that happen in, what was he, year 6? Is that what he was this past season? So
year 7, probably, right?
Year 7, like, that's a pretty big deal. And so it leaves me wondering, and I wouldn't normally wonder that about someone who's been in the league so long. I'm like, there might just be still more layers that he's going to uncover.
Well, hopefully he uncovers the free throw shooting, because that is the one thing that took a dip last year. And at different points, you're like, what is going on? It felt like every time he stepped to the free throw line, he split them. So that's something he has to improve going into this year. The 3 is still a little low for the amount he shoots them. So those are areas where I think he can improve, but he makes up for it in other areas. And the attention to defense has to carry forward too, because it's so frustrating 2 years ago, watch him with his physique, his size, his past success as a defender continue to underwhelm there. But credit to Mazzulla too, who I think put him in positions where he was focusing on one assignment, which is where his strength obviously is on that end. But continued improvement in those 3 areas are what I'm looking for.